Good evening. Welcome to Regent College. We are delighted to be together. Today is a beautiful day, and it's beautiful then that we get to call. But as we reflect on the beautiful place where we live, it is important that we remember and that we acknowledge that we live, work, worship, and study in the considered traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples. We're very thankful for it and for them. Tonight we have a wonderful event. We would like to ask you that if those of you present here, if you need to leave this room, just make yourself up quietly and be mindful of doors being closed at all times. We are trying to prevent any disruption to come into our lecture. And I would like to also welcome those of you who are watching us online. And we have also a disclosure. It's a notice of filming for a live stream. Regent College hereby announces that it is filming and live streaming tonight's evening public lecture. By entering this location, you agree that Regent College has the right to live stream your likeness, image, voice, etc., for the duration of this event. You also understand that you will not be compensated in any way for use of your likeness, image, voice, etc. in this live stream. Being on these premises today means that you release and hold Regent College harmless from any claims or actions that arise as a result of this production. Thank you for your patience. We just needed to read this disclosure for you all. My name is Pablo. I am a student here at Regent. And now I would like to introduce you Professor Dr. Paul Spilsbury. He is our dean, academic dean here at college and professor of New Testament. Please welcome Dr. Paul.
Thank you, Pablo. From Pablo to Paul, it seems like an appropriate handover. Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here at the beginning of this year's Evening Public Lectures, 2024. Here we are. We're doing this again. We're very excited about the lineup of speakers for this year, in the spring now and then later in the summer as well. So we're delighted. We're starting with such a strong opening bang with Susan. Delighted to have you here again, Susan. Thanks for coming and for being a part of Regent all of these many years. Let me keep my glasses on. Okay, so our format this evening will go in the familiar way, where Dr. Phillips will speak for 50 to 60 minutes, and then she will welcome questions. And if you do have a question, be thinking it as you're listening, how you'd like to engage. And when the time comes, we'll invite you to go to one of the microphones over there or over there, and then to ask your question, and we'll be happy to do that for perhaps up to 30 minutes or so, depending on what people have to say. And for those of you who are online, you also can participate in the Q&A by sending your questions to questions@regent-college.edu, and I believe Pablo will relay those to us here at the front, and we'll take things from there. And then after the lecture, Dr. Phillips is happy to be at the bookstore for a short while to sign any books that you may have, if you'd like her to sign a book, presumably one of hers. And there are some of her books at the bookstore, though I'm told that there are currently only a few copies of her books because they've been selling. So that's a good thing too. So let me say a few words of introduction. Dr. Susan Phillips has been coming to Regent since the mid-90s and has taught in summer school just about every summer from that time till now. And just about every time has been given an evening public lecture as well. So Susan really is one of our regulars and is a part of Regent College. It's delightful to have you with us again, Susan. Susan served as the executive director at New College Berkeley from 1994 to 2022. Prior to that as the academic dean, and currently still on faculty at Berkeley and teaches in the Graduate Theological Union as well. As you all know, I'm sure that she is keenly interested in the spiritual life, and especially as in its outworking in our daily lives, drawing insights from the diverse fields of the social sciences, biblical spirituality, and practical theology. She's a sociologist. She's a spiritual director. She teaches on a wide range of subjects pertaining to all of those topics. So we're delighted that you're here again with us, Susan. Susan also, I should say, served on the Board of Governors here at Regent College for some 9 years, I'm told. She's published numerous books. She has been on editorial boards, and she also, I'm told in my notes, worships at First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley and has served there as an elder. So all of that is to welcome you, Susan. We're looking forward to your talk this evening on the topic of movements of our hearts, holding hope and grief. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be with you here. Wonderful to be back under the green roof. And you can tell I'm sort of a Regent lifer. I come here almost every year, and I love Regent, as I imagine many of you do too. So, thank you for coming here and pondering with me some of the things that have been on my mind and in my heart these past few years. I spoke about it a bit 2 years ago, that I've been very intrigued by the presence of ambiguous loss in our lives, exacerbated by the global COVID pandemic. And for a long time as a spiritual director, I've noticed how people come to direction with what I've called unrequited hopes. And I think there's quite a connection between ambiguous loss and unrequited hope. They both involve the thwarting of our dreams, and they involve, to some degree, the disenfranchisement of loss and grief. So I'm going to share tonight some of what all of that means and how I've been thinking about it and witnessing it. First, I want to talk about a friend of mine. She's a person who's taught me a lot about the human heart and its movements and its capacity for loss and hope and joy and sorrow. She's in her 90s now. She grieves the absence of her husband, who died nearly 20 years ago, and also the absence of her daughter, who died far too young. While missing those beloveds, she also embraces the joys of her grandchildren and the vibrancy of her garden. Influenced by the poet Mary Oliver, she often says to me, "All this joy, all this sorrow, how can a heart hold it all?" My friend is one of the most thankful and joyful people I know. And she's also a person who I can turn to in my deepest sorrows and know that I will be heard. Over years of faithful, prayerful living through some tragedies and a number of thwarted hopes, her heart's been stretched to hold joy and sorrow, her own and those of others. I hope you have such a friend. We're all challenged to allow God to stretch our hearts, especially in this globally connected culture that brings us ceaseless news of great grief. We see chilling images coming to us every day from Ukraine, from the Holy Land, from Somalia, Syria, Haiti, other parts of the earth. Pondering this global weight of grief, a friend of mine sent me a poem by Rosemary Watola Traumer, a poet who grieves her daughter's early death. The poem's called "For When People Ask." And she, this poet, like my friend in her 90s, ponders the capacity of the human heart to hold the paradoxical and intensely contrary feelings we all bear Before reading it, let me just tell you, you may know, I didn't always know this, that Tuva, T-U-V-A, is a remote Russian republic bordering Mongolia in southern Siberia, populated by traditionally nomadic yurt-dwelling tribes. Thank you, Wikipedia. The style of singing of the people in Tuva is very distinctive, harmonic, and world-renowned. So here is the poem. I want a word that means okay and not okay. More than that, a word that says, I feel it all at once. The heart is not like a songbird singing only one note at a time, more like a Tuvan throat singer, able to sing both a drone and simultaneously 2 or 3 harmonics high above it. A sound, the Tuvans say, that gives the impression of wind swirling among rocks. The heart understands swirl, how the churning of opposite feelings weaves through us like an insistent breeze, leads us wordlessly deeper into ourselves, blesses us with paradox, so we might walk more openly into this world so rife with devastation, this world so ripe with joy. I have found that a very helpful poem. The heart does hold swirl and paradox. Sometimes we numb ourselves to it. Poets, philosophers, and psychologists tell us that wisdom consists of the growing capacity to tolerate ambiguity and live with paradox. Scripture is full of this. Jesus' mother, filled with wonder and joy over her newborn son, is in awkward circumstances and is told that a sword will pierce her heart. Psalmists join lament and praise, as do prophets. Facing death, Jesus washes the feet of his friends and serves them at the table. And he receives perfume poured over his feet and a meal served to him by his friends in Bethany. All this joy, all this sorrow. In the shadow of the valley of death, the fragrance of the perfume filled the house. One of the areas of interest to psychologists today is that of thwarted grief. You might call it ambiguous loss or disenfranchised loss. Different people call it different things. A person who pioneered the study is psychologist Pauline Boss, and she's been writing about it in terms of how the pandemic has exacerbated this kind of loss. It's a sort of grief which is compounded by loneliness, confusion, and lack of acknowledgement. I remember as a young woman in a Sunday school class at First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley, and noticing which types of loss were okay to get a public airing, you know, in the request for prayer from the group. So it's okay to ask for prayers for your elderly parent who you're trying to care for, or for a beloved sibling suffering from cancer, or for help sleeping because you have a colicky baby. Other sorts of loss that even I knew were present in our community were not acceptable. People didn't talk openly about struggling with an addiction, or even about garden variety mental challenges like anxiety and depression. I think that in the past few decades, we've become better at listening to the whole variety of things from which people suffer from and bringing them before God. And it's certainly true that some churches are better than others. I remember at about the same time going to a black church in the States, and in the middle of the service, a man stood up and said, "Pray for me, brothers and sisters. I fell off the wagon last night." And the whole community sounded audibly sympathetic and compassionate to him. That would not have happened in my church at that time. So tonight we're going to look at some of the forms ambiguous loss can take, and then ponder together ways that we can be helpful to ourselves and others in the midst of that. One kind of ambiguous loss is the goodbye without leaving. So this is when the person you're grieving is physically alive but no longer a part of your life, or no longer in the same way connected emotionally to you. This can happen with divorce, with estrangement. There are rising rates of estrangement in families. Happens with a chronic illness like dementia. Can happen with rejection from a community. Termination from a job, which is your primary social community. We've seen a lot of this in Northern California and the Silicon Valley, where the workplace is almost like a home, so termination is especially grief-inducing. The relationship has changed radically in the bereft person's emotional experience, but our culture lacks rituals and frameworks for the grief that ensues. So recently, my husband and I hosted a meeting of our book group, our nonfiction book group. We began meeting about 12 years ago, and in the group there were 5 couples. Now, 2 of the men are no longer able to join us for health reasons. And as one of the women who'd been with us was leaving, I walked her to the door and she lingered there. We had not spoken about her husband, and I said, "I miss Sherman." Her husband, Sherman, a distinguished retired historian, is now several years into physical and cognitive decline with Lewy body dementia. She responded, "I miss him too." She lives with him, and yet she experiences this long goodbye without his absence. Her understanding of herself and him is being radically altered. And we don't discuss it in our group. It is the fact of her life. I notice it in church. In our church, there are some people who divorced years ago but still come to the church. They don't associate with each other, but they still participate. There's a kind of grief there that doesn't get acknowledged. I also see spouses who come alone now because their spouse is no longer able to be there, quite a few of them because of dementia. The spouse who comes to church has lost that person who remembers so many special moments in their lives and has lost the person who has worshiped beside them. Other people come alone because a spouse has turned from the faith, lost their faith, no longer shares the faith that they used to share. There is a leave-taking there too. The person has changed significantly, but has not left. How do we grieve such a loss so our heart can move more freely? That's key. Unless we allow the grief to flow, to move, to be encountered, that grief will block our hearts. It'll block their movement. It'll block access to new hopes, new loves. The second kind of ambiguous loss is that of leaving without a goodbye. Psychologists write about this as happening when one can't reach a beloved person and may not know where they are or if they're still alive. This used to happen when connectivity was much worse than it is now. I know my grandmother was an immigrant to the United States, and she would go for long periods of time not knowing if certain people in her family in another country were still alive. I know children who have been adopted, or some have been abandoned by a parent, and there was a leaving but never a goodbye. Church communities, I think, we have a particular form of this kind of loss. And I've witnessed it at large churches where there have been splits over doctrine. People one was used to seeing at the church are no longer there. In a large church, it may take a while to even realize that's what's happened. There's grief to it, but no organized expression and acknowledgement of the grief. And as a spiritual director, I see it from the other side too sometimes. People who've long been part of a church and then leave, and no one contacts them. In a large church with, ragged attendance, especially after the pandemic, we don't necessarily know someone has left the church. And so there is a leaving without a goodbye. Again, our hearts are constrained when there's no opportunity to address this loss. This third sort of ambiguous loss shows up in the literature as situational loss, which may or may not include a goodbye. This has to do with parting from familiar structures, securities, physical capacities, expectations. In my own family, I watched my grandmother suffer from unexpressed situational, ambiguous loss, something I only realized after she had passed away. But when she was a teenager, her family suffered reverses, and their status in the community plummeted, their material comforts thinned, and by virtue of being the youngest daughter, she was denied the opportunity to go to college. The family just couldn't afford it. Her older sister went, her brothers went, but she was not able to go. She married into a family in which everyone had gone to college. Her mother-in-law, her sisters-in-law, and also the men. She was surrounded by college-educated people, all proud of that achievement. As a child, I knew she was unhappy about something. It would manifest in odd ways, in envy and bitterness, sometimes shame, rumination, compromised empathy, and finding other channels for self-aggrandizement. On the whole, my grandmother was a good woman and had a good life, and I loved her. But there seemed to be no healthy way for her to mourn the loss of her early dreams. The churches she attended didn't help her, apparently, deal with this, and she was of a generation that didn't seek out psychotherapeutic counsel. She did her best while suffering privately, but that thwarted grief leaked out in not very helpful ways. So a grief that's thwarted, that isn't allowed to be aired and healed, doesn't just stay inert and passive. It can fester, regress, become primitive, and it can erupt violently So I think of some of the perpetrators of terrible crimes like mass murders, who prior to that seemed like very quiet, solitary, nonviolent souls. And I wonder, were they suffering from some kind of lost dream, some kind of thwarted grief? I don't know. Scripture does understand this. In Proverbs 13, it says that hope deferred makes the heart grow bitter. To some degree, I think that's what happened with my grandmother. So, that kind of deferred hope can have dangerous consequences. Right now, the world is torn with war. People in war zones are having multitudes of losses that are not being grieved. Actual physical losses, relational losses, and the devastation of hopes and dreams they had cherished. We know from history that people who suffer that way may later become violent. So there's a real danger to this. We just went through the pandemic. Maybe we're still in the pandemic. I don't know. I'm never quite clear on that. People lost all sorts of dreams. Kids didn't have normal school experiences. People who dreamt and studied and prepared to go to college didn't have the college experience they thought they might have. Marriages and funerals and graduations happened without the gathered community. I know a woman who suffered a terrible depression after giving birth to a child and didn't quite understand why. And more than a year later, thanks to a lot of therapy, realized that she was deeply grieving not being able to have her mother there when she gave birth because the pandemic forbid it, and she had always imagined it happening that way with her mother. In our churches, we can have ambiguous situational losses. Now, there were those in the pandemic, and most of us, like schools, like Regent, have created alternative opportunities that are so creative. But in churches, there normally are generational and cultural changes. And people who've been a part of the church for a long time can register that as loss. And if there's not a healthy avenue for grief without accusation and judgment, just grief that is met with compassion, it can become bitter. You may have seen this in churches. I have. There can be a profound nostalgia for the way church used to be. I can feel it. What? No more hymnals? No prayer of confession in the service? My church does that, but some don't. People, even clergy, coming to church dressed so casually? I can feel a loss. Not a profound loss in my case, but I can feel loss. And there's no space for the clean, honest grieving of those kinds of losses. So I would encourage you, when you are worshiping with your community, to look around the sanctuary and notice unacknowledged griefs that are present. Maybe notice the grief you're carrying that doesn't get spoken. Allow yourself to pray with that. Some of my most moving experiences in church is watching people I know have some private grief and yet are there praying and singing hymns. I am deeply moved by that. the parent who's recently had a child diagnosed with a condition that means that child will be a dependent adult. That is a great grief with very complicated threads of loss. The man who trained for a career has a young family to support and just found out that not only has he lost his job, but the market has changed in such a way that he may be becoming obsolete. And I watch as those people sing praise to God and as they pray. How can we be helpful as individuals and as the church in situations of thwarted grief? How can we come alongside people and hear their heart's desires and their pain? Help them acknowledge the reality of that grief and still stand with them in a place of hope. That's a challenge. Job was dealing with completely unambiguous and enfranchised grief, and his friends had a hard time staying with him for the long haul. How do we, too, find ways of being sufficiently vulnerable about our grief that we don't chastise ourselves for it and that we're able to bring it before God and others? Traumer says our hearts can hold paradox. We can sing multiple notes at the same time. And I imagine all of you know that experience of being in deep grief with someone and then suddenly laughing because of the intimacy and the closeness. The whole of the experience, the whole of who you are, finds space for expression. But the harmonics of both joy and sorrow, hope and grief, can be held in that space. So let's think now about what is helpful. I think there are rising rates of ambiguous loss, of thwarted grief, and I think it poses a danger to ourselves and to our society. So what can we do that's helpful? First and foremost, it's recommended that people identify their loss. Pay attention to it in its details and ramifications. Notice the multiple emotions, the ways in which the loss touches different areas of your life or the person you're listening to's life. So I'll tell you a story from my life. Long time ago, I was suffering from infertility. And it was an affliction in all the dimensions of affliction. There was physical suffering, the suffering of barrenness and of all the medical treatments to try to achieve fertility. There was the emotional suffering of continuing to long for something that just kept moving farther and farther out of sight. There were multiple forms of social suffering, seeing my husband's sadness and that of my parents, especially my mother, who really wanted to be a grandmother, feeling envy and emotional separation from friends who were happily pregnant or had children. There was psychological suffering. I criticized myself for my lack of faith. I criticized myself for my grief, for my lack of joy in rejoicing with my friends. Also for the lack of some kind of holy detachment that would enable me to count it all joy and not be so troubled by the experience. That's a kind of psychological moralism that I was imposing on myself. We do read in Scripture that we are to count our trials all joy. But I would say that's a long-term goal, and it's best achieved by acknowledging the grief and moving through it with compassion. I also experienced spiritual suffering. I wondered why God was not granting this good hope of mine. It just seemed strange. Did I not understand God rightly? Part of what helped me identify my loss was journaling. And I journal in the morning. At night, when I'm going to bed, I do a prayer of examen from the Ignatian tradition, where I look back over the day and notice the movements of my heart towards God, away from God, open and available, closed and hard. And then in the morning, I journal about that. Now, I didn't talk much about the infertility with friends because it went on for years, and you feel like your friends are going to sort of burn out on hearing you say the same thing every time you get together. But I believed that God welcomed what I had honestly to bring. And so that's what I was able to do in my journal, and I was able to explore the different dimensions. I noticed that when I was with someone who told me she'd just become pregnant, that I felt desolation when I wanted to feel joy. So that practice was extremely helpful for me. Another recommendation is seeking support. If we find a compassionate listener, we can really air our griefs so they don't become compounded and compacted and fester. We can bring the light of God's grace and allow the love of the listener to touch them. We see this with Jesus after his resurrection when he's appearing to people, that he invites them to express the fullness of what they're experiencing in their grief. He doesn't just show up and say, "Ta-dam, here I am, let me tell you what's going on." He comes up to people, like on the Emmaus Road, and inquires about them twice. He essentially says, "What's up? What are you talking about?" as you walk along. And it sounds like he's inviting them to identify their grief in all its complexity, and that he will be there, stand there, and care and listen. And that's a very long speech that the two of them say, where they're grief-stricken, but they had hoped, and they're bewildered, they're very disoriented. And Jesus, who's had a heck of a week and has a big story to tell, stands there and listens to them. I find that totally amazing. He invites them into a kind of prayer of examen about their recent experience. In terms of talking with someone, be aware of their trustworthiness. You don't want to be with people who say things like, "Well, so-and-so went through this and they didn't have such a hard time with it." It adds insult to injury. Or who says, "Right, I know that happened and that was terrible, but it's been a long time." You want someone who can hear it. At my church, there are focused support groups for people with losses that aren't easily aired in public. And I don't know about a lot of them. I do know about a few. They operate with a great deal of privacy and confidentiality. There are groups for divorced people, for people married to people who no longer are believers, a group for people whose children are embracing different sexual or gender identities than the parents had expected them to embrace, groups for people suffering from estrangement by children, for people experiencing infertility, for people seeking work. So some of these groups can be wonderful, and when you're in a place like this, if you have the energy to be creative, you might assemble a few people in similar straits so you can support one another and pray together about something it might be very hard to explain to someone who hasn't gone through it. Spiritual directors don't work with people who are seeking mental health help from mental illness. We're not trained for that. But we do see a lot of people suffering from unrequited hope for something good, thwarted hope for something that seems an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God would fulfill. And so spiritual direction can be very helpful, as can certain kinds of therapy. Again, my mind goes to Jesus after he resurrected. Mary Magdalene walked to the tomb early in the morning after observing Shabbat, as did others. She had believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and despite all he'd said about dying, none of his companions seemed to have imagined what was going to happen. They'd seen their Lord die an agonizing, shameful death, and they were left with grief and in personal danger. Nevertheless, she and the others entered the rituals of their culture around death, and she went to the tomb to care for the body. Jesus beheld her. He beheld her grief, and he asked her why she was weeping. Yet again, he's got a big story to tell, and the first thing he does is elicit the feelings, the grief of the other. And then after revealing himself, he was with her in the complexity of her feelings: joy, bewilderment, shock. And he acknowledged her as the whole of who she was. She was a grieving, loving woman, now shocked and bewildered and overjoyed. And he appointed her to tell others about his resurrection. The people who can really be supportive to us are the ones who can see us whole. We may be the person who's grieving terribly, but we're a lot of other things too. God sees us whole. Another suggestion for coping with ambiguous loss is to be creative. So forming a support group could be that. People engage in rituals and ceremonies, and many people invent their own. I had a friend who gathered some friends, and she took a bucket of rocks. And these rocks were griefs that she was carrying in her heart. And they went to the ocean, and she threw them in. And her friends loved her. And it was a very significant moment for her in addressing her grief. Some churches hold very small, private divorce ceremonies, where friends and family gather around the couple that are, and perhaps children, that are going through this dissolution of the marriage, and they love them. Some churches hold services for babies that die in utero. What's crucial is the validation of the bereft person's grief. The way through grief is through it. And coming into it and observing it and acknowledging it with a loving, small community is very powerful. There are other ways of being creative. King David wrote Psalms, and many of the Psalms hold grief and hope. And you notice the order they're in. Almost always grief, then hope. Occasionally, only grief. Occasionally, just hope. But to get to the hope, one needs to traverse the grief. Pilgrimage is another creative way of coping with grief. I remember on a pilgrim trail encountering a man who told me that he'd been walking for weeks. Prior to walking on the trail, he had been with his father for a few months as his father died. Prior to his father's dying, the two of them had been estranged for years. But he went home and he cared for his father, and there was reconciliation, and there was loving care. And on the pilgrim trail, he was able to do sort of a life review and notice the whole of that relationship with his father, the good times, the bad times, and to just bring it before the Lord, and on occasion, speak of it to a kind stranger on the trail. God is sometimes very creative in how God approaches us in our suffering. So another post-resurrection story. Jesus came to the disciples in that locked room. They were scared. Some were doubting. Some had actually witnessed the risen Christ and still were scared and doubting. He said, "Peace be with you." And then he said, "Receive the Holy Spirit," and he breathed on them. That was creative. I don't know that he'd done that before. And they received that. I had an experience fairly recently. A friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, has been suffering from Alzheimer's for a few years and has become impossible to communicate with, doesn't remember how to use a phone. Very sad. And I knew her mother through her and had sort of a Christmas card relationship with her mother, but we would write to each other. And one day I was outside and I got a text and it said that her mother had passed away a few days earlier. And I felt such grief, but I also felt an awful lot of guilt that I hadn't stayed in touch with her mother, hadn't reached out to her mother. And then I looked up and there was a rainbow. So, like you, I know the Genesis story of the rainbow. And I took it to be a sign from God that God was with me. So God is creative in God's approach to us, and we can be creative in our interpretation. And I took that rainbow as for me in my grief. Transforming movements also help us. And these are, we can't force them, but we can be open to the possibility of the gradual revision of our identity. Who are we now, having lost this dream, this relationship, this situation? We can experience an altered attachment. It's not what we had hoped, it's not what it was, but maybe there's a different kind of attachment. We can hope to accept paradox and to find new meaning in our lives. It may take years to go through life cycles that allow for this. the first Christmas celebrated without an estranged child, the first wedding attended as a divorced person, the first big trip taken as a solo traveler, the first baby shower attended when one has accepted one's childlessness. These things can be very painful, but they enable us to revision ourselves, to create new traditions. One of my friends lost her husband tragically suddenly in the pandemic, and she didn't travel for a while. Well, most of us weren't. Now she travels with a single sister who, it turns out, had always wanted to travel with her. It evokes complexities of the grief because her sister's not her husband, and it allows for a new transformed attachment with the sister and new possibilities. So we trust that there is a way through the desert, a path in the wilderness, a light in the darkness, even when we can't see it. We hold on to faith. Back to Jesus. Peter went fishing after Jesus died. He went to where he'd first met Jesus. He returned to what he knew, what sustained his family, the place where he could encounter frustration and also perhaps buffer himself against the world-tilting grief and confusion of Jesus' death. Jesus again goes out of his way to find these people he loved, and he goes to the beach in the night. He knew that Peter suffered the grief the others suffered, and he knew he suffered from guilt for his denial of Jesus. The Holy One knows the nuances and particularities of our feelings and of our griefs. The connection with Peter at the lake is an exquisite depiction of attuned healing from the mixed feelings which can compose an ambiguous grief. He took the trouble of going to the place where Peter was in charge. He witnessed the fishing failure, acknowledged and rectified it, even as he began to prepare a meal for Peter and his friends. He worked in the dark. Peter was in a very dark place. But the light of the campfire glowed in that darkness, and the dawn began to break. And people it dawned on them who Jesus was. And Jesus greeted Peter as the complete person he was. Yes, he was a person who was in grief, felt some shame, felt some guilt, maybe some despair, and he invited him to contribute fish to the meal. And then he engaged in that public restoration of Peter. 3 affirmations for 3 denials. He prompted Peter to express his love, something Jesus hadn't doubted, but he knew that was necessary, and he welcomed that expression of love. And even when we're in the dark, even when we're feeling ashamed and guilty, Jesus welcomes our love. Another way of coping, and I love this phrase, is to hallow our diminishments. It comes from Teilhard de Chardin. It's mystifying, I think, but appealing to me, someone who actually remembers when Regent was in trailers. I have diminishments I'm facing. And to hallow, we know that word, to venerate, to reverence, to consecrate, to set apart as holy. Hallowed be thy name. So some diminishments may be external due to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Some may be due to aging, to loss, physical defects, intellectual or cognitive limitations, regrets, failures we're ashamed of. How do we hallow our diminishments? Those that are ambiguous losses that haven't been properly grieved. I've witnessed it in some of my friends. I'll tell you about one. One of them had a medically required hysterectomy 10 years ago following many happy years of childbirth. She did not grieve her sudden infertility, but she gained quite a bit of weight. No effort enables her to lose that weight. She exercises, eats right, even participates in sprint triathlons. Her physician tells her she's healthy and doing all the right things. Yet she carries weight that she loathes. It feels shameful. Sometimes people seem to disdain her about it. And she grieves the loss of the body she had preferred. Yet recently she told me she's beginning to accept this intractable situation and ponder how it could be a kind of blessing. She told me that maybe it's a thorn in her flesh, which helps her be more empathetic to others who suffer from intractable conditions, especially those that seem shameful and attract scorn. So she's beginning to see the glimmer of light in the darkness of her affliction. She is hallowing this diminishment. But her honest acknowledgement of the grief has helped her do so. And I find her to be a teacher of me. William James in the 19th century, as a psychologist, wrote that what is most healing in grief, ambiguous and otherwise, is the expulsive power of a new affection. It doesn't have to be romantic love. It could be something creative, like art or civic engagement. It could be loving a neighbor better, or a pet, or getting involved in some kind of social justice work, bearing some other people's burdens. Once we identify our loss and allow it to be aired and to move, then it no longer becomes that stuck block in our heart that can fester. And then there's space for new affection. This new affection can be for Jesus. One of the things I do is I help lead the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius over 30 weeks. It's 30 weeks of journaling, doing the prayer of examen, and accompanying Jesus through his life. And it is a very profound experience of meeting Jesus and being fully met oneself. When we go through it, we are with him and hear Bartimaeus' voice and notice that he doesn't just assume what Bartimaeus wants. He says, "What do you want me to do for you?" We are at that campfire with Peter. We smell the burning and the fish. Maybe we smell the fishermen too. And we witness the healing and restorative encounter between Jesus and Peter. And we might imagine Jesus beckoning us over. So, new affection for Jesus is possible through grief. And with that new affection comes greater hope. So I want to close this lecture with an excerpt from a prayer found in Douglas McKelvey's Liturgy of Sorrow and Lament for the Death of a Dream. Douglas McKelvey has edited that collection of books, Every Moment Holy. And our own Claire Perini here interviewed him in a wonderful interview that I think is probably available on the Regent website. So here is this prayer. Feel free to pray with me. O Christ, in whom the final fulfillment of all hope is held and secure, I bring to you now the weathered fragments of my former dreams, the rent patches of hopes worn thin, the shards of some shattered image of life as I once thought it would be. What I so wanted has not come to pass. In my head, I know that you are sovereign, even over this, over my tears, my confusion, and my disappointment. You are the sovereign of my sorrow. You were always faithful, though I could not always trace quick evidence of your presence in my pain. Yet did you remain at work, lurking in the wings, sifting all my splinterings for bright embers that might be breathed into more eternal dreams. I have seen so oft in retrospect how you had not neglected me, but had, with a master's care, flared my desire like silver in a crucible to burn away some lesser longing and bring about your better vision. So let me remain tender now to how you would teach me. Amen. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. That was really wonderful. You've offered us such a insightful and nuanced account of ourselves. I'm really grateful for that. Thank you for everything you've shared this evening. It's just been very meaningful and helpful. Please, if you have a question or you'd like to engage with Susan, please do go to one of the mics. And again, if somebody would like to send a question to Pablo, questions@regent-college.edu. I loved your line about the heck of a week that Jesus had had. That's quite a way to refer to Passion Week. That was good. I found it so interesting, too, that you talked about the importance of naming, to moving from ambiguity somehow, like that the ambiguity is itself such a difficult aspect so often of our experience, when in not knowing and not identifying and having kind of generalized, unspecific anxieties and so on.
Right, and it can take quite a long time to really identify much of what the experience is for you. Like I spoke about my years of infertility. I didn't know all of that at the time, but retrospectively, I saw more of it. So, yeah, I think it's revealed to us gradually.
And I love the way that you talked about how in those post-resurrection experience, the various ones you talked about, that Jesus elicited responses, that he elicited emotion, that he recognized. So sometimes you can think of those things as Jesus sort of like almost, they're sort of, kind of all-knowing, kind of wanting to just set himself up for the thing he's going to say. But, your sense that he's actually calling forth the person's emotions and recognizing those emotions. Yeah. I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah, I read it that way. And I'm so grateful that this book, written more than 2,000 years ago, contains such raw humanity. These people are the people we honor in the faith, and yet they had some control over what stories got told, and they allow us to see them failing and floundering and being very confused and being nasty, brutish, and short, and all of that. I think that's because they know and trust that God loves them in the fullness of their humanity.
Something that struck me as you were speaking is that you're calling us to a maturing Christian experience, a maturing of ourselves as people, as human beings. And it reminded me of the ancient, and even you're speaking of the Ignatian practices and so on, spiritual exercises. It reminded me of the ancient emphasis on Christianity as a way of life and as a philosophy of life. The ancient fathers drew a lot from the Stoics and from the Epicureans and other philosophers. And they saw all of life about trying to bring their lives into alignment with the deepest beliefs and commitments and so on. And I feel that that's what you're doing as well. You're helping us to kind of think through our sense of grief and loss and so on, but to think about it in the light of the deep truths that we hold to be given, and yet recognizing how often we're out of alignment with that, but not beating us up either, not sort of saying, well, get yourself in line, but to see life as a long process of maturing, of growing into the experience of being fully human, to being, all that we might be.
Yeah, I like the way you say that. We are always trying to mature, and part of that is being willing to face more of who we are and what our experience is. And that goes on for a lifetime. That's why the Christian life is such an adventure. We never hit some sort of steady state of enlightenment.
We don't?
No, sorry. Well, I don't think so.
We've got a question over there. Thank you, Pablo.
Yes. We have a question online coming from Vernon Law. And the question is, with unanswered prayers, how do we best navigate the grief that they have not been answered, and yet hold on to the hope that they will be answered in my lifetime?
That's one of the hardest questions, isn't it, for all of us? What do we do with unanswered prayers for things that seem so good and right, that seem to be within God's power to grant? That's a road we walk. There isn't an actual answer. The answer is the relationship. And I've been blessed by the people I accompany in spiritual direction, so I've been able to see them come before God in prayer with some really profound suffering that even I protest in my heart. And in that place of prayer, they experience God's love for them. And sometimes in that experience of loving connection with God, they don't even ask those why questions. They come back to God again and again, while also not denying the fact of what they would like, what they desire.
We have another question. When we can't find help in our churches, is there any advice for actual churches to do something different?
When we can't find help in the churches, do you have advice where they might find?
If you cannot find help in the churches?
In one's own church.
Well, there are other smaller communities, and I know some people I know pastors who tell me their real support group where they can be really honest is some kind of 12-step group. Churches are difficult because they are true communities, and not communities that operate on strict principles of privacy and confidentiality. And some of these losses and griefs we carry are ones that we don't want being told beyond a small group. So I encourage people to be careful about that, because if one person who you trust then tells another person you don't know very well about your story, it just becomes a story that gets told, and that could be painful. That's why my church has these very small, focused support groups with strong ethics of confidentiality and privacy. We don't even know, I don't know who's in those groups.
Hi, that was a really useful lecture, so thank you for sharing that. I was wondering, for people who maybe try to brush grief under the carpet or like just try to move on with their lives, when you were saying about you have to go through grief, I've had a lot of friends who have had major losses but don't want to talk about it or approach it and just sort of push it to the side. How do you best support someone when that's their approach to it?
So with people who don't want to talk about it, sometimes just being with someone. When I was in a time of great grief and loss, I had a friend who would just show up and we'd walk and I could talk about anything. And there was a time that I heard a story from a man whose son had been a soldier and was in combat. Now, most of us have not been in combat. So that experience is very hard to share with people who have not gone through it. And so the son would sometimes come to the father's and mother's house and put in a CD of a war movie, you know, like Saving Private Ryan or something. And they would just sit on either side of him, loving him, not saying anything. And he would occasionally say, I saw that. I did that. So just being present. And they found it with first responders too, right? It was a great idea to let them talk about what they suffered. But if they're forced to do it, it embeds the trauma. Whereas if they're free to share, then it can bring healing. And it can take a long time. I have directees who were in combat, people I've seen for decades. I have only heard about the combat once or twice, because they know I don't, on the inside, understand that, empathetic and prayerful as I might be. So.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was great. Do you think there's a requirement or there are opportunities or times where whole communities can sort of publicly or communally share in grief or lament? And have you seen examples of those? And do you think there are moments for where they need to happen? And if so, how would you propose they should happen?
Talking about, are there cases where whole communities can share in grief together?
Oh, yeah.
Any thoughts about how they might do that well?
Yeah, communities can hold grief together. That's true. At my church, there was a woman who went ahead with a pregnancy even though it was known the baby wouldn't survive the delivery. And the whole community gathered around that family as they mourned the loss of that child. Communities can be great with awe and wonder, too. I was out looking for the aurora borealis on Saturday at like 1 a.m., Sunday, I guess. I didn't see anything. But I was with all these people, hundreds of people, quietly looking at the sky. So yes, communities can hold grief and wonder in amazing ways.
I think the best way, thank you for this talk. Lots of talk you talk about really make it related to me, especially you're talking ambiguous loss. When my husband, a professor, declined to the point that he could not read, I asked him, why you didn't read? Just a simple sentence. And he said, I'm afraid that I read wrongly. It was a loss. So you're already grieving the loss of him, not the person you married. And you felt lost for him because he did not know what he did not know. Mm-hmm. Then you cry out to God. Your community tell you this is a trial. You go through a trial. You cry out to God that you have already done your best, and then He will answer. He answered. I really cry out, how long, God? How can I go on? My brother in Christ, my family doctor already said, you're at the end of the rope, Wendy. You burn out, you're frustrated, everything. So I said, look, God, but when you physically lost him, it's a second loss. Mm-hmm. But what I'm trying to say is the hope. You have to reach out. Why I'm here? Because I decided that I have to go back to my community of believers. As I talked to you, I went back to Wycliffe in University of Toronto. I continue to try to be amazed by people's ideas, how they break through, how they are intelligent scientists talk about the universe being God's creation, so all kinds of faith that you draw on. And you have to, I was told, come, go to Regent College. Okay, Regent College in Vancouver. Yes, there's lots of good memories because it was 12 years when we were working in Hong Kong University and going back to Toronto. We always take a trip as a stop in Vancouver. But could I tolerate this? There's a double thought, right? You may miss him more, rather than other people say, "Oh, we have to be forgiving." How other people trying to comfort you? Oh, may the happy memory of your love sustain you. It's very hard to do that. But I think you have to do it yourself. That reaching out, get the resources, crying out to God. I can tell you, even within these 2 months, at least I heard God talked to me several times, challenging me. Why did you tell people that you are no longer center of anyone's life? Did you sing to me that be my vision, be my center? Talking to God before? Why do you say that you feel alone in the world? Didn't you sing before that he lived, he walked with me and talked with me? He challenged me. That's good, right? I think that's how you're going to get out of this in hope and strengthen your faith. And once you reach out, especially with those, we are not unique, losing husbands and loved ones to dementia. There's so many. And now I'm being helped by someone who, within half a year, not just losing his husband to Parkinson, but a son to brain tumor. She's a good sister. She called me. When do you have to go to Vancouver? I'm now in Amsterdam because I want to go back to where my husband and I went each year for the Oregon conference, their missionary family. Yeah, so up to the last day, when I was chased to pay my tuition, I still said, can I go? Can I go? I'll go. Mm-hmm. I'll go. And the 4 books really already helped me. I forgot, what was the woman writer about talking about going through a transition?
Wrap it up a little bit. We need to wind it down.
It's the
Thank
pregnancy, going through pregnancy, going through grief, uncertainty. And anyway, okay, I'll stop. But just have to reach out and learn something from your grief.
Well, you really suffered a long leaving without a goodbye. Thank you for sharing with us. And it's a privilege to be part of Regent, part of this new affection in your life. Thank you.
I think should we wrap things up there? Friends, I think we'll draw our time here to a close. Susan will be available in the bookstore for a little while, so you'll be able to chat to her there if you would like to. Just a couple of closing things as we go our way this evening. One is to thank you all for coming, of course. It's lovely to have you here at the beginning of our series. Also want to thank the donors who make possible these kinds of evenings. And we would invite you to be a donor as well, and you can do so by going to the Regent website. You can go to rgnt.net/give, and you can make a donation there. And there's also a QR code, I'm told, at the door that you can scan, and that would be very welcome. And then, other than that, to say that tonight's event will be available sometime in the near future in a recorded version on youtube.com/Regent College. So you'll have to find this evening again if you want to share it with someone else or just to refresh your own memory of everything that we've heard tonight. And then other than that, it just remains to say once again, thank you so much, Susan, for this wonderful evening. Thank you so much.